Hello, and welcome to our continuing series, Lexington Remembers. Today's program is the first in a mini-series that we are doing on older houses in Lexington, and we call it Hidden Gems. We hope you enjoy this new mini-series. And now, to Dan Fenn.
This episode of Lexington Remembers focuses on some of the old houses in Lexington. We all know about the Hancock Clark House and the Monroe Tavern and Buckman's Tavern and a couple of old houses on Massachusetts Avenue go way back. But we have an enormous, rich inventory of older houses which have great stories. There's nobody more able to tell those stories than David Kelland, who is the chairman of the Historical Commission.
There are three historical entities in Lexington. One is the Historical Society, which owns the Hancock Clark House and the Buckman Tavern and the Monroe Tavern, even though I think they're on town land, but they own the buildings and they maintain them. And that's a private organization with lots of members. I'm a life member. I'm sure you are, as is Marjorie. The two commissions, the two town commissions, are the Historical Commission and the Historic District Commission. And in the historic districts, of which there are 4 in Lexington, including the East Lexington Historic District, in which we're now sitting, they extend about 200 feet back from Mass Ave. The Historic District Commission regulates paint colors, types of windows, roof shingles, storm doors, pretty much everything you can do to your property that affect the appearance of it. Not so much the history, but the appearance. And they are appointed, I think it's 2 from the library trustees and 2 from the Historical Society and other people. The Historical Commission, on the other hand, of which I'm the chair, operates in the whole town of Lexington to inventory and record the history of its buildings and sites that are important to the history and also the architecture of the town. So we keep an inventory which now runs about 17 or 1800 buildings in Lexington. We don't have anything to say about the buildings in the historic districts. That's the Historic District Commission. The Historical Commission has one power and one power only. We operate under the demolition delay bylaw, which says that you cannot, if a house is historically or architecturally important, you cannot simply tear it down without a review of the Historical Commission. And there's a lot of detail in that law, and I won't go into that. But that law operates outside the historic districts. The Historic District Commission in the Historic District can prevent the demolition of an old house or a historic house forever. The Historical Commission outside the historic districts can delay it up to a year. And that's it. So there's a balance in Lexington between these 4 historic districts along Mass Ave, Hancock Avenue, and East Lexington, and the rest of the town. The rest of the town simply tries to maintain its housing stock, its historical housing stock, by slowing people down enough so that perhaps another person can be found to buy it, or the present owner can be talked into I shouldn't use the word renovation, restoring it and preserving its history. That's the point.
Well, I knew there were a number of Revolutionary War houses, but I had no idea there were 17 or 1800. Your inventory is much larger than I thought, David.
Well, the inventory includes a lot more houses than Revolutionary era houses. It includes, for example, and I won't go into this at great length, but Moon Hill, which is famous architecturally as one of the earliest movements of bringing the outdoors indoors by using by using glass walls, flat roofs, to have less impact on what you look at outside, and that sort of thing. And the famous architects who I couldn't name off the top of my head, who designed Moon Hill and Turning Mill and Shaker Glen and some of the others, those houses, even though they're built in the 1950s, are in the inventory of historic and architectural houses.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, how many members of the commission are there, and how long have you been chair, and how did you get into this business?
Well, I've been the chair of the commission since 1994, which I think is 14 years. I've been on the commission since 1983. The reason I got on it, or the way I got on it, was that I bought the house that we'll be looking at a bit later here on Mass Ave from Ed Hoxie in 1980 for $82,500. Incidentally, if you'd I like to have.
Not today.
No, I'd charge a few more dollars. But living across the street was a man named Roland Gubish, who was the chairman of the Historical Commission. And Roland came over one day and said to me, as I was replacing the corner posts, the 10 by 10 corner posts in this house that were rotted out, he said, you must know something about old houses. And I said, I don't, but I'm learning fast. He said, would you like to be on the commission? So I joined in '83.
Uh-huh. And how is the commission appointed?
The commission is appointed by the town manager with the approval of the selectmen, and the terms are 3 years. And the idea is to have people with some kind of historic background. Now we do have, right now we have one architect, 2 architectural historians who really know. One is Sally Zimmerman, who runs the Historic Homeowners Program for Historic New England, which used to be Spinia, if you remember that. Marilyn Fenellosa, who is has a legal background, but has also a master's degree in historic architecture. Wendell Kelso, who's an architect, and Frank Kern, who lives in another old house, which would be an interesting subject for this program sometime, over on Lowell Street, down by Boose's. It backs right up to Boose's farm, actually. And Frank works for the financial end of the state government. So that's the commission at the moment.
Okay, well, that's edifying. That clears up a few questions. Now, tell me about this house in which you and Marjorie live here on Mass Ave. I don't know anything about the history of it. Driven by it many, many times. We're going to take a look at it as we go along here. But tell us about this place of yours.
Well, it's one room and a door, and I'm really kidding because that's our garden shed. We had to go to the Board of Appeals to build that because we wanted to put it up against the stone wall, and the way they would have for 200 years. But actually, the house that we live in is behind us. Well, we're looking at the back of 884 Mass Ave, where Marjorie and I live, and this structure, which is unpainted and meant to be that way, is the barn. People didn't paint barns in those days quite often, and the clapboards are made of pine, and they dry out when it rains, and they are probably what you're actually looking at is the L of the original barn. This is only a small part of the barn, and this is probably only 150, 175 years old. So the windows, I don't know whether you can see them very well with the tree there, but there's a large window which is original in the barn. And then Ed Hoxie, who lived here from 1930 to 1980, built a workshop in the back of the barn and taught jewelry making and ran a scout troop. And so he put in that little extra window. And below that, you can see a little heater. That heater is to heat the workshop. And it's supposed to have a propane tank outside, but we don't use it, so we get rid of that. And the door and the window, a little bit to the left here, are part of the kitchen. And that little extension used to actually go back another 10 feet or so, and in that extra little part were the outhouses. And it was a two-holer, as they are sometimes referred to, so that they're gone because the inside of the house had two storage rooms. And the two storage rooms were in between the two halves of the house, and they were both converted into bathrooms, one of them in 1927 and one of them more recently. So the outhouses are long gone. So the door, which we call the north door, since we're on the north side of the house, is actually added by me. So that door actually goes through a little passageway where we hang coats and that sort of thing. And the window is now it goes into part of the kitchen. The main part of the house was moved here in 1834. The original part of the house is from the door into that little kitchen passageway, from the barn up to the main part of the house. That little 1.5-story house, which is typical of East Lexington, there are dozens of them, used to face the street. And what they did was that when they got affluent in 1834, they bought the main house down the street and moved it up here and swung the 1.5-story part around to form the L. And the L was probably built in 1780 or so from the condition of the beams. You can usually tell from the saw cuts just about when they... And the front part was built about the same time also. But the whole house in the 1830s was converted to Greek Revival. And Greek Revival movement is just very briefly, the Turks ruled Greece for 400 years. And in 1823, I think, they went home. After destroying, if you've been to Greece, you know how disappointed you were not to see a lot of temples. There are only a few, because the Turks systematically destroyed the temples in Greece. And the Parthenon survived, not very well, but it's still there, thank goodness. So that the whole world became concerned with Greek revivalism and or the Greek revival movement. So a lot of these houses had pillars stuck on the front of them and pediments over the front doors, and particularly here in East Lexington because of an architect named Asher Benjamin. And Ann Grady wrote a book about East Lexington, and our front door is on the cover. And the book is mainly about the architecture of Asher Benjamin.
David, as you show us this and the different pieces of this house, it strikes me that recycling is not exactly a new invention for Lexington. I mean, we've been recycling houses and moving houses for generations, haven't we?
We have, Dan, and there were one problem with it, of course, was that they only had horses and logs in those days. But the advantage was they didn't have any wires to take down, so they could move the house as it was. And I think we're looking now at the northeast corner of the house, and you can see an L here with its own door, and that and half the main house have constituted an apartment since 1834. It's Lexington's first condo. And I say condo because in 1834 they didn't have enough money to pay to move the house up here, so they sold half the property. And this was a man named Eli Whitney, and he did not invent the cotton gin. He was a businessman in Boston, and he bought the house, and he sold the half that we're looking at, the right half, including the rights to the stairs, of which I think we have a photograph now, to someone else. That was 1834, and 1846 he probably sold the house to someone else, but they bought it back, and it included this half of the backyard that we're sitting in. This whole property is half an acre. So so that was the early form of mortgage, I guess. And then I think we have the main part of the house, as you can see with the door in the center, is a typical, well, what people call a colonial house. Now, colonial houses, of course, stopped existing in 1776 on July the 4th because we ceased to be a colony. Now, I know they still build colonial houses, but that's because we still feel like a colony, I guess. The main part of the house was moved here, 1834, and the original house, which was a story and a half, was turned to form an L in the back. And there was a mystery, because what I haven't told you about this house is that the big barn is gone, and it was attached to the barn that you have seen, and it took up half the backyard. It was said to be the biggest barn in Lexington, and it was demolished in 1939 to save on taxes. And in that barn, for several generations, the Lowe family, L-O-W-E, operated a slaughterhouse. And when I bought the house in 1980, I was advised to rip up 5 floors. They added floors as they wore out. They used sand and brooms in the old days to clean them and lie, and it wore out the floors, so they had to add a floor. Well, they added 5 floors. So in the old part, there are 5 floors. And an architectural historian, I won't name, told me to rip those up and make sure that the timbers underneath were good, because that old house sits on the ground. Oh, there's a few rocks, but that's it. And it slants quite a lot. You can roll things down the bedroom floor. Well, I got the brilliant idea that since I had a son just getting out of the Marines, he knew how to dig ditches. So we dug a ditch all along this side, the back side of the old house, and he dug underneath each room. There are 3 rooms. And he dug a ditch big enough for him to crawl in, and found that the structure of the house was fine. There was just enough room to put insulation under the floor, which we used chicken wire to hold up, which he did. But all the dirt that he dug out from those trenches was put out here and forms this garden of lilac trees that I saved from Bloomfield Street. And they were little then. Now they're full size. But there was a mystery. In this dirt was cattle bones and chicken bones by the hundreds. And I want to introduce you, if you can, to my wife Marjorie, who moved here from England, and I'm going to let you tell Marjorie tell how she solved the mystery of how they got those bones under that L.
Well, David told me he didn't understand this, and I thought about it for a while. And I said, well, maybe the house was moved when they brought the big house down. Maybe they moved the small house, and it was actually a yard. And that's how the bones got there, because there was no house over that particular spot. And I think that's correct.
Well, I think it's correct too, because I can't think of any other explanation. So, pretty clever. And those bones, of course, have really fertilized these lilacs like mad. So you find history like this when you preserve an old house. And the more you go looking into things. Someone asked me at a meeting only a few weeks ago why they use Roman numerals to number the beams in old houses. And all I knew was that they numbered the beams because they cut them one year, they were green, and they put them in the cellar hole over the winter to dry out. And then the next year they built the house, and the beams were numbered as to where they went by the design of the house. But why Roman numerals? Well, I suddenly thought it's perfectly obvious why they use Roman numerals. Have you ever tried to cut an 8 or a 3 with a penknife? Hardly. The Roman numerals are all a simple slash. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but I tell it as a story anyway. If we're now on a different, filming from a different aspect, you can see the main part of the house, the front door. The front door is original. It's in terrible condition. I haven't touched it in 20 years because it's serviceable, and I don't know how to fix it. And people want me to get rid of it and get a nice new door, and I refuse because it's 200 years old. One of these days I'll figure out how to fix it. Surrounding it are some fake Greek columns that were very typical of Asher Benjamin's architecture when he converted a lot of these houses to Greek Revival. And then it's a typical, what they call a Roman temple design. The Roman temple shape of these houses is the roof angle, the 2-story height, and 2 bays. Bays meaning 2 windows and a main room on one side of the house, and 2 windows in a main room on the other side of the house, and 2 more upstairs just like it. So upstairs there are 5 windows, downstairs there are 4 windows and a door. When you come around to the south side of the house, which is where the sun shines, one of the features that I like to point out to people are the original clapboards, which were made of pine, and they were made, the joints that you might be able to see in this film were actually 15 degrees rather than butt joints. And the clapboards were made of green pine, so they made these joints on a planing board, and it looked like an old-fashioned shoemaker's board, and they put the clapboard in, and then with a hand planed a 15-degree scarf, they call it, so the 2 scarves fit together. And it's very tricky work because the clapboards are not flat. They're thicker at the bottom than they are at the top. So one of them has to be tilted a little one way and one tilted the other way so that the 2 scarves fit together. And no one I've ever met knows how to do that today, except me. And I can only do it on a bandsaw, and I have a little tilting arbor for the bandsaw that will do that job. But to do it with a hand plane and with modern cedar kiln-dried clapboards is impossible. They just splinter. So then you see the original part of the house. It's a 1.5 stories high. You can only stand up in the middle of the bedroom upstairs. which is enough to put your pants on in the morning. That's all they needed. Yes, I banged my head on the ceiling. The windows are low. They're built down to the floor, and they're only 3 panes high. This is typical of East Lexington. There were many, many of these houses. But you walk around East Lexington, and you can see these L's in the back of these houses. And I would be willing to bet that most of them were original houses facing the street, because East Lexington was an important industrial center way before Lexington. In the 1700s and the late 1800s, there were tanning industries, bookbinding industries here. I don't know what all, but the houses were modest, very modest. So I don't want to make this too long, but this is a story and a half L, and it's original. And the third bay was where they kept the horse. And that was before this barn L was built. The main barn was there, but there was a barnyard, and when it rains and you sit in our kitchen, as it did the other day, and if you have a little leak in the roof and the water runs down the old beams, you can smell horses strongly. And that doesn't happen very often, so we don't get too many complaints. But history is seeing and listening and learning and smelling, and there's a lot to it. Dan?
David, what do we know about the original owners and the original builders and the people who lived here over the years? You told us about the slaughterhouse. That's a fascinating story. What about the people?
Well, the first people I know about, the first person I know about was Eli Whitney, who moved the main house here in 1834. Before that, I have no records. As you probably know, the town records, Lexington's town records, before, I'm not sure, the 1860s or something, burned up. So the town records are gone, but the Middlesex County records are here, and I have a deed research folder about that thick, and it's very difficult to understand because pieces of the house were sold, the property lines were redefined, pieces of property were bought from next door, and you have all these deeds, and they're handwritten, and they're very badly copied, and they're very hard to read. Beyond the Eli Whitney, the Lowe family bought the house, and I've got a picture that shows them all standing, probably 1880s or so, out in front, because the bicycle, they're standing with a bicycle, which is a modern design bicycle. And I'm not sure when they came in, but it certainly wasn't before then, perhaps turn of the century. The house at that point had shutters. It does not have shutters now. I do have a collection of original shutters from a house up the street, which would fit this house, but the house originally did not have shutters, and most of the houses in Lexington did not. They were a later innovation in the 1800s, and they rot out very quickly. The Lowes owned the house until 1930. Now, Ed Hoxie married Marion Lowe, whose original name was Marion Dinwoody, and I have her graduation picture from Lexington High School. She was adopted by the Lowe family, and when she met Ed Hoxie, they married in 1930, and they lived in the apartment side, the north side of the house. When Mr. Lowe died, they moved Mrs. Lowe into the apartment and Ed and Marion into the main part of the house, which includes the old L, to have a little more room. That was 1930. In 1970, Marion Lowe died. Ed and his son Ralph and a daughter Barbara lived here from Well, I don't know from when, maybe from when they were born. But in 1980, Ed put the house up for sale. And I was driving with Deirdre Neiman, a real estate broker in town, past the house, and Ed Hoxie was nailing a for sale sign in the front yard. And I said, "Stop the car. This is the house." And she said, "No, it isn't. It's not the one we're going to." I said, "Well, it's the one I'm going to buy." So we jumped out, and this was a Friday morning, and Ed said, "You can't buy it because we're having an open house with a realtor from Winchester tomorrow." And I said, "Well, I just took a real estate course, and I know that if I give you what you're asking, you have to take it." And I don't know whether it was true or not, but he took it. So I wrote him a check for $1,000, and the poor real estate lady watched half her commission go up in smoke because she wanted to sell me another house. And the original real estate broker also wasn't very happy because he only got half a commission. But I ended up with the house, and I remember Ed saying, "Well, don't you want to look inside?" I said, "Yes, but I want to buy the house first." So in 1980, we became the proud possessors of a house that needed, well, it's 28 years now, and we're not finished.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Before you bought it, there are only two families of us, I mean, who knew before Eli Whitney, but just those two families that had owned it over all those years. Eli Whitney was a major player in East Lexington, wasn't he? Yeah, I think I've heard.
Businessman.
Yeah, Larry Whipple talk about him. Okay, well, thank you, and now we'll go on to the next house.